I never thought silence could be this cruel. The day of my husband's funeral, the church was heavy with incense and whispers. I sat at the front pew, clutching the folded handkerchief he once pressed into my palm years ago. My hands shook, but I held it tight, as if the fabric could keep me from falling apart. All I wanted was to cry, to let the grief pour out of me like a storm. But I should have known better because they didn't let me. Eleanor, my husband's sister, leaned close to another relative, her lips curling in that way she always did when she thought she was clever. "She's always been fragile," she said, her voice just loud enough to float over the hymn. "Look at her already lost without him." Laughter bubbled between her and Caroline, the youngest niece. It wasn't kind laughter, or even nervous laughter. It was sharp, like glass dragged across my skin. When the coffin was lowered, my chest cracked open. I sobbed openly, shamelessly. And that was when I heard it. Caroline's whisper so clear it might as well have been shouted. Pathetic. She doesn't even know how to hold herself together. I wanted to scream, to turn and tell them grief doesn't have rules, that losing the man I had shared 40 years with was not something I could politely swallow back. But the words died in my throat, because that's what I had learned with them over the years. Silence. Even my own son, Michael, didn't defend me. He kept his eyes down, shifting in his seat, pretending not to hear. He was always like that, too quiet, too eager to keep peace, even when peace meant letting me bleed under their words. The burial ended, the earth shoveled, and still their comments kept drifting to my ears. Victor, my husband's older brother, straightened his coat and said, "Well, now she'll see what it's like to manage things herself. Not that she ever did before." I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted iron. The truth is, this wasn't new. Their mockery had been the wallpaper of my life. I had grown used to being the shadow in the corner of family dinners, the one they laughed at when I stumbled over a word or asked a question about business I wasn't meant to understand. I had been trained to swallow shame and smile politely. I thought grief might soften them even for a day. But I was wrong. They didn't even let me cry. I sat in that front pew with my husband's coffin before me, and every sob felt like a performance they rated, a weakness they tallied against me. By the time the service ended, my grief had twisted into something else. Not anger, not yet, but a kind of hard seed planting itself deep inside my chest. When we stepped out of the church into the cold air, Eleanor brushed past me with a smile too sharp to be mistaken for sympathy. "You'll have to lean on us now, Louise. You've never been good at managing things alone." The words landed heavier than the dirt on my husband's coffin. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was raw from holding back everything I wanted to say. But inside something stirred, something that felt almost like defiance. I thought funerals were for mourning, for remembering. But for me, it was the moment I realized how little they would ever allow me to be human. To them, I wasn't a widow. I wasn't a grieving wife. I was an object of ridicule, even in my deepest sorrow. That day, I buried my husband. But I also buried the last of my silence. When the funeral was finally over and the house emptied of flowers and whispers, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the silence. It was strange, the quiet. For 40 years, I had lived in this house with my husband, Robert. His presence was steady, sometimes warm, sometimes distant, but always there. Now it was just me and the tick of the grandfather clock. The silence felt heavier than the coffin we had lowered into the ground that morning. And with silence came memory. I thought back to the decades of dinners, the holidays, the gatherings where I was always the joke, never the voice. Eleanor rolling her eyes whenever I spoke about books or gardening. Victor telling stories about how I once burned a roast chicken as if that defined my whole life. Caroline mimicking my soft voice in front of everyone. Even Michael, my own son, laughing nervously along with them sometimes just to keep the peace. It wasn't one sharp wound. It was a lifetime of tiny cuts. I became background noise in my own life. Robert never joined in their mockery, but he never stopped it either. Instead, he would retreat into his study, that locked room with the heavy curtains drawn. Whenever I asked what he did in there, he would only say, "Work. Things you wouldn't find interesting." And I believed him. Or maybe I just accepted it. That door became a symbol to me, a line between what I was allowed to touch and what was forbidden. I learned not to ask questions. I learned to be content with the corners of life they left me. But sitting there after the funeral, staring into the silence, I realized how much of my life had been spent being underestimated. I was always too soft, too emotional, too naive. They said I didn't understand business. They said I wouldn't survive without Robert. And the worst part, I believed them. I built my world around small things: flowers on the windowsill, teacups stacked neatly, a garden tended in the back. Things they all sneered at, but things that gave me peace. I told myself it was enough. But now Robert was gone, and the family was circling like wolves. Their voices still echoed in my head from the funeral. She's never managed a thing, she won't know what to do. And I was terrified they might be right. Still, something inside me felt different. A seed had been planted in that church pew, a kind of quiet rage at being stripped of even my grief. For years, I had let their laughter define me. But sitting there alone in the silence of my house, I realized I had a choice. I could keep believing their story about me, or I could finally write my own. My eyes drifted toward the hall, to that locked door, the study. It loomed in my memory like a secret I had lived beside for decades, but never touched. Robert had kept it sealed from me. But why? Why had he needed such distance, even from his wife? That was when I remembered the envelope. It was still sitting on the side table, unopened among the sympathy cards, plain white, my name written on the front in his handwriting. A strange detail considering Robert had never been a man of letters. He preferred silence to words. I picked it up, my hands trembling as they had at the funeral. I slid my finger under the flap, and my heart nearly stopped when a brass key slipped into my palm. The note inside was short, almost blunt. Louise, the study is yours now. Everything inside belongs to you. They will mock you. Then they will beg. Then they will try to take. Do not bend. I stared at the words, my breath caught in my throat. All my life I had been treated as fragile, mocked as if I had no strength. But Robert had left me something. Not just the key to a locked door, but a warning, a command. For the first time in years, I felt something stir inside me that wasn't grief or shame. It was resolve. I must have read that note 100 times. They will mock you. Then they will beg. Then they will try to take. Do not bend. The words didn't even sound like Robert. My husband was a man of few sentences, never the sort to speak in riddles. And yet here he was warning me from beyond the grave. The brass key pressed heavy in my hand, as if it carried not just weight, but a choice. I told myself I would wait, that I was too raw from the funeral, too tired to face whatever secrets lay behind that locked door. But the more I tried to sleep, the more that study whispered through the silence of the house. It had always been a mystery. For decades, I dusted around its door, watered the plant that wilted by its curtained window, set dinner on the table without asking why Robert spent hours locked away inside. I thought it was pride or habit or some private ritual I wasn't meant to intrude on. But now, knowing he had left it all to me, my mind reeled. By midnight, I couldn't resist anymore. I lit a lamp and padded down the hall. The floor creaked beneath my slippers, each step sounding louder than I wanted. My hand shook as I slid the key into the lock. It fit too perfectly, as if it had been waiting for me all these years. The click echoed through the hall. When I pushed the door open, the air that spilled out was stale and cold, like a room that had been holding its breath for decades. Dust floated in the lamplight, tiny ghosts rising from the floorboards. The study was immaculate. Bookshelves lined with leather spines, a desk polished to a dark gleam, curtains pulled tight over the window, their edges frayed with age. The room smelled faintly of paper and ink, but also of something sharper, like metal. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me, my eyes caught on the desk first. On top of it sat a small stack of envelopes, each neatly tied with twine. Beside them, a leather-bound ledger and a pile of official documents stamped and sealed. I reached for the nearest folder, my hands trembling. The words inside almost didn't make sense at first. Property deeds, investment accounts, certificates of ownership, each one bore my name, not Robert's, mine. Page after page, document after document, all transferring wealth, land, and shares to me. I sank into the chair, my knees giving way. For 40 years I had been mocked, dismissed, treated like a woman who couldn't manage a thing. And yet, Robert had trusted me with everything. I pressed my fingers to my lips, fighting back tears. For once, they weren't from humiliation, they were from something else. A kind of fierce gratitude, a kind of rage, too. Rage that he hadn't told me, hadn't prepared me, but instead left me to discover it only after he was gone. And then I saw it. Another envelope placed squarely in the center of the desk, my name written across it in his careful, deliberate hand. I tore it open, my pulse roaring in my ears. Louise, you will feel alone. They will come to you with false kindness, with begging, with threats. I have seen their hunger. Do not give in. What is here is yours, not theirs. Stand firm. This is the only justice I can leave you. I stared at the letter until the words blurred. Justice, that was the word he used. For years, I had swallowed their laughter, their insults, their dismissals. I had learned to live in silence while they decided who I was. And Robert? He had seen it. He had seen it all. And in his own quiet, guarded way, he had left me the only weapon I would ever need. I folded the letter carefully, tucking it back into the envelope, and laid my hand flat on the desk. For the first time in decades, I wasn't afraid of that locked door. I was ready to face whatever came next. The very next day, the vultures came. I didn't tell a soul about the study, about the papers, about the fortune Robert had hidden away in my name. But somehow they knew. Maybe they always suspected. Maybe they could smell wealth like wolves smell blood. Eleanor was the first to arrive. She didn't bother calling ahead, just marched into my living room as if it were hers. Her voice was syrupy, her smile too wide. "Louise, dear," she said, her eyes sweeping the room, searching for the study door. "You must be so overwhelmed, so much to handle all on your own." I just stared at her because I knew what was coming next. She perched herself on the sofa, folding her hands like a saint in a painting. "It would only make sense for me to help. I've always managed the family's matters, haven't I? And you, well, you've never cared much for numbers. Why don't you let me handle the estate? Just for now, for your peace of mind." Her words were honey, but her eyes were knives. Then came David, the nephew. He brought flowers as if I would forget who he was the moment I smelled roses. He called me Aunt Louise in a voice so soft it almost fooled me. "You shouldn't carry this burden," he said. "Why don't you let me oversee the finances? It's too much for you." "Too much for me?" Caroline stopped by later, dropping her voice into a pitying whisper. "Everyone's talking, Auntie. They say you're fragile. That grief has clouded your mind. You don't want people thinking you're unfit. Better to let us guide things before it gets messy." Unfit. That word clung to me like rot. And even my son, Michael. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he didn't drink. "Mom," he said gently, "you can't manage all of this. You've never had to. Just be reasonable. Let the family help. Reasonable. Help." I wanted to laugh, but the sound stuck in my throat. Each of them thought they were clever, disguising hunger as concern. But I had Robert's words echoing in my head. They will beg. And I saw it now. This wasn't kindness. It was begging dressed up as charity. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I didn't give them the satisfaction. I simply said no. 3 letters, 1 word, stronger than any speech I could have given. Eleanor's smile cracked like glass. David's flowers wilted in my eyes. Caroline's whisper turned sharp. Michael sighed and shook his head, disappointed as though I were the child and he the parent. But I stood firm. For the first time in my life, I refused to bend. And as the door closed behind each of them, I knew something else. Robert had been right. This was only the beginning. It didn't take long for the smiles to rot. When my refusals piled up, the visits changed. No more roses, no more pitying whispers. Now it was sharp voices, clipped tones, words that stung like whips. Victor came first, filling the doorway with his broad shoulders, his jaw tight. "Louise," he said, not bothering to pretend anymore, "you're making this harder than it needs to be. You can't handle an estate this size. I'm the eldest brother. It should fall to me." "That's how family works." I met his eyes steadier than I felt. "No, Victor, that's not how it works." His face twisted, and for the first time, I saw the greed in him, raw and naked. "If you think a signature makes you untouchable, you're a fool. Paper can be challenged. Wills can be contested. Don't test me." Then he left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the glass. After him came Caroline. She leaned in close at the grocery store, her voice low and cruel. "People are already talking, Auntie. They say you're losing your mind, crying at the funeral like a mad woman, forgetting things. It wouldn't be hard for a judge to see you as incompetent. Imagine what that would look like, all that money, all that property stripped away. Better to hand it over now before you're embarrassed." Her perfume clung to me long after she walked away, sickly, sweet, and suffocating. David wasn't subtle either. He called late one night, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard. "Do you really think you can win against all of us? You'll burn yourself out trying. Sign it over, Louise. Be smart for once in your life. For once in my life, the words hit like a stone, and then my own son. Michael didn't threaten, not outright, he just sighed over the phone, his voice heavy with disappointment. Mom, you're making enemies of everyone. Don't you see? They'll destroy you. Just stop fighting. Give them what they want. It'll be easier. Easier? For whom? I hung up on him. That night, I found my car tires slashed in the driveway, the rubber shredded clean through. My heart pounded as I stared at the wreckage, the air thick with the smell of burned rubber. The next morning, I noticed the study door. The lock scratched, the wood splintered, clear marks of someone trying to force it open. The house, once my refuge, no longer felt safe. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump, every shadow on the curtains looked like a figure waiting. But I remembered Robert's words. They will mock you, then they will beg, then they will try to take. Do not bend. And I realized I was living the script he had written for me, every step of it. I was scared, yes, terrified even, but I was also angry. For 64 years, I had been their target, their punchline, their weak link. And now, when they thought they could finally strip me of everything, I found something inside me they had never seen before. Steel. So I locked the study tighter. I kept the documents close. And I waited because I knew the next step would come, and when it did, I would be ready. I knew it was coming. Every visit had sharpened, every word carried more venom. It was only a matter of time before they stopped pretending altogether. It happened one evening just after sunset. The sky still held a strip of gold at the horizon, but the house was dim, shadows stretching long across the floorboards. I had just made tea when the knock came, loud, hurried, insistent. I opened the door, and they all filed in. Eleanor, Victor, Carolyn, even David. Michael trailed behind them, his face pale, his eyes refusing to meet mine. They didn't wait for an invitation. They filled my living room like a storm cloud. Victor spoke first, his voice booming. Enough games, Louise. We're done begging. Hand over the documents. Eleanor sat down without asking, smoothing her skirt as though she owned the place. It isn't right. You know Robert never meant for you to keep it all. You're confused. You've always been confused. Caroline stood near the window, arms crossed, eyes glittering with spite. Everyone's laughing at you, Auntie. Do you know that? They say you're clinging to things you don't understand, that you're embarrassing yourself. And David, oh, David, he smiled like a snake. We can settle this quietly, or we can drag it into court. But if we do that, we'll bring everything into question. Your health, your memory, your sanity. Do you really want that kind of spectacle? Their words battered me from all sides, louder and sharper with every breath. I tried to speak, but Victor cut me off, stepping closer, his finger jabbing the air. Sign the papers, Louise. Tonight, or I swear. That was when I snapped. Or you swear what, Victor? My voice shook, but it was steady enough to slice through their noise. That you'll break into my study again. That you'll slash more tires. That you'll tell the whole town I'm insane. The room went still. Eleanor's mouth opened. But no words came. Caroline shifted uncomfortably, her mask of cruelty slipping. Michael finally lifted his head, his face stricken, but he said nothing. And me? For the first time, I felt taller than them all. I walked to the study, unlocked the door, and carried out the box Robert had left me. The weight of it in my arms felt like justice itself. I set it down on the table with a thud. Their eyes followed every move. You think I'm weak, I said quietly. You think I'm too soft, too foolish, too fragile. You've thought that my entire life. But Robert didn't. He trusted me more than he ever trusted you, and he prepared for this. He knew exactly what you would do. I pulled out the stack of sealed files and laid them open. Inside were copies of Robert's will, legal testimony he had recorded, every document signed, notarized, and airtight. And more than that, evidence of their fraud. Proof of Victor's debts, David's shady dealings, Eleanor's thefts. The color drained from their faces. You want to drag me into court? I said, do it. I'll bring this with me. I'll bring every last word Robert left, and I'll show them exactly who you are. The silence was deafening. Victor's fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't move. Eleanor pressed her lips so tight they went white. Caroline's eyes filled with tears, not of guilt, but of panic. And Michael, my son. He looked at me as if seeing me for the first time. They left without another word, slamming the door behind them. The house shook with the echo, but my hands didn't tremble. Not anymore. For the first time, I realized I wasn't just defending papers or money. I was defending myself, my dignity, my voice, and I knew the fight wasn't over. But I also knew I wasn't afraid of it anymore. I thought the confrontation in my living room would break me, but instead it set me free. They thought their anger would frighten me back into silence. They thought I'd cower the way I always had, bowing my head while their words cut into me. But I had Robert's papers. I had his voice in my ear. Do not bend. So when the summons arrived, their challenge to the will, their attempt to have me declared incompetent, I wasn't afraid. My hands shook when I read it. Yes, but there was no fear in my chest, only fire. On the morning of the hearing, I walked into that courthouse with the box clutched tight to my chest. Eleanor and Victor were already there, dressed in black as if grief could cover their greed. David was pacing, whispering frantically into his phone. Caroline sat in the corner, her face pale. And Michael. Michael avoided my eyes. They didn't expect me to come prepared. The judge asked for statements, and their lawyer stepped forward first. His words dripped with poison. Mrs. Mercer is grieving, unstable, unfit to manage such a vast estate. We have evidence of her erratic behavior, emotional instability, and lack of understanding of financial matters. Erratic, unfit. I had heard those words before. They had been whispered in dining rooms, smirked at family gatherings, laughed over glasses of wine, and now they were carved into legal arguments, sharpened into blades meant to cut me down. But when it was my turn, I opened Robert's box. Your Honor, I said, my voice trembling but clear. My husband anticipated this. He knew what his family would do. That's why he left these. I laid out the files one by one. Robert's will signed and notarized. His recorded testimony, his face flickering on the screen as his voice filled the room. If you are hearing this, it is because my wife is under attack. Everything I own belongs to her. I trust her with my life, even in death. To my family. Mock her if you wish, but you cannot take what is hers. Gasps filled the room. Eleanor's face turned scarlet. Victor muttered under his breath, fists tight. But I wasn't finished. I opened another file and another, spreading them like cards in a hand they couldn't beat. Evidence of Victor's hidden debts, proof of David's fraudulent dealings with company funds, records of Eleanor skimming from Robert's accounts years ago. This, I said, my voice steadier now, is what my husband left me. Not just an inheritance, but the truth. And if they wish to drag me through the mud, I will drag them with me. Every document here will become public record. Every scheme, every theft, every lie. The silence that followed was heavier than the judge's gavel. Their lawyer stammered, trying to recover, but the damage was done. Eleanor stared at the table, her hands shaking. Victor's bluster collapsed into quiet defeat. David's lips moved silently, counting the cost of exposure. Caroline cried softly in the corner, mascara streaking her cheeks. And Michael, my son, finally looked at me, not with pity, not with dismissal, but with something I hadn't seen in years. Respect. The judge cleared his throat. Mrs. Mercer, the will stands as written. The estate belongs solely to you. Case dismissed. It was over in a single stroke. As they shuffled out, their heads low, I stayed seated, my hands resting on Robert's box. I should have felt triumphant, victorious, but what I felt instead was quiet, a stillness that ran deeper than any silence I had ever known. I wasn't just the widow anymore. I wasn't the joke, the fragile one, the shadow in the corner. I was Louise Mercer, and I had finally been heard. When it was done, when the gavel fell and the vultures scattered, I went home to a house that felt entirely new. The silence was still there, but it no longer pressed on me like a weight. It stretched around me like space I finally owned. For the first time in decades, the silence belonged to me, not to them. News traveled quickly. Eleanor stopped showing her face in town after whispers of her theft spread. Victor's debts dragged him down so deep he had to sell off half his property. David's fraud came to light in the company he worked for. They cut him out before he could drag them under. Caroline disappeared for a while, embarrassed, then resurfaced with a bitterness that couldn't touch me anymore. And Michael, my son. He came to me a week later, shoulders slumped, eyes soft. I'm sorry, Mom, he said. I should have stood by you. I looked at him for a long time. Part of me wanted to lash out to remind him how he let me face them alone, but another part, the larger part, only felt tired. Tired, but free. You saw me the way they saw me, I told him quietly. Now you know better. He nodded, shame flickering in his eyes. That was enough. I walked into the study that night and shut the door behind me. The same door I had feared for 40 years. The door I once thought marked the distance between me and my husband. Now it was mine. The desk, the bookshelves, the documents, all mine. I sat down in the chair, running my hand over the polished wood, and let the truth settle. I had survived them. I had survived their mockery, their begging, their threats, and I had stood firm. Robert's words echoed in my head once more. They will mock you, then they will beg, then they will try to take. Do not bend. He was right. They did, and I hadn't. For the first time in my life, I felt taller than every sneer, every insult, every laugh that had been carved into me over the years. They had underestimated me, dismissed me, tried to strip me of my grief, my dignity, my voice, and in the end they destroyed themselves with their greed. I looked around the study, this room I once thought was a cage, and saw it now for what it was, a gift, not of money, not of property, but of justice. So I straightened the papers, folded Robert's last letter, and placed it gently in the drawer. Then I leaned back in the chair, my hands resting calmly on the arms, and whispered to the empty room, I'm not bending anymore. And the silence at last felt like applause.